system or the IRS. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Robert. Thanks for having me on the show. The IRS, there's basically three kinds of agents that the public might run into. Revenue officers, and those are the ones that collect the taxes, on a civil basis. The auditors would be the second group. If you have a tax return and you get a call from an IRS agent and they want to audit the tax return that you filed from the past, so they're called revenue agents. So we have revenue officers do the collection, revenue agents do the auditing, and then I was a special agent in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. And that division it ranges back when I was there 20 years ago. They had about 3,000 criminal investigators that are called special agents. And it's correct that we would be issued a badge, carry a gun. We carried a Sig Sauer 9mm handgun. I believe they're still carrying those handguns today. So the job of a special agent is to investigate violations of the federal income tax and money laundering laws. So I did that from 1993 through 1999.
So that's 6 years with the IRS. So most people would say that gives you a very unique perspective, because the vast majority of the people, you're saying there's only about 3,000 agents in that position. The vast majority of Americans have never been in that position or have probably even known someone in that position. So I think that's what gives your story a lot of credibility. And I think we were just talking about how you just published your new book. I believe it came out in February, that expands on the story and the journey that you went through. So take us back to, I know your family's been in law enforcement. What made you want to get into being an IRS agent to begin with? I think even just getting into that was a pretty fascinating story that you had.
Yes, so I graduated from San Jose State University in 1986 with a degree in accounting, and then I spent several years in the private sector and what's called public accounting. Back then there were 8 large accounting firms. Now I think it's down to, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4. They continue to consolidate. But so for about 3 years after college, I worked at KPMG. So that's one of the firms that's still around after all the mergers. International accounting firm. And then I became a controller at a venture capital firm in Menlo Park, California, kind of there in the South Bay area where Google and Apple and all that stuff, Silicon Valley, that most people are familiar with. But after spending, from 1986 until about 1990 in the accounting profession, I just realized that there was no way I was going to be able to keep my motivation strong for another, 30 or 40 years of a work career.
Too much crunching numbers, I could see that.
Right. Maybe I should have realized that when I got the degree. But anyway, I was told by a mentor that, of course, having an accounting degree was very valuable because you'd always have work, and he was right about that. But anyway, I realized I needed to accent the career path a little bit. And I had a lot of relatives and friends who were in law enforcement. Mostly uniformed law enforcement, but I had a couple friends that were in federal investigators, and so I chose to take a little adjustment in my career path. I had achieved a certified public accountant certificate in 1991, issued by the state of California. So I was a CPA, and with a degree, and decided to apply to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The FBI. I think it's still the case. They seek out people with law degrees, accounting degrees, and of course the FBI is all too happy to have practicing attorneys or CPAs. And so I had achieved that level when I applied to the FBI. Meanwhile, I had a friend of the family who was an IRS special agent, and he recommended that I apply not only to the FBI, but to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division as kind of a backup, because he could tell that my heart was set on the FBI. And of course we're talking about 1991, when the FBI had a little better reputation than it has today. But anyway, my heart was set on the FBI. It still had a much better reputation than the IRS has ever enjoyed, that's for sure. But I did apply to the IRS, courtesy of that advice from my friend. And the FBI application moved along quickly. I competed on various tests, all of which I passed. There were psychological evaluations and physical evaluations, background investigations. And I basically made it to the point where I was waiting to be called to Quantico, Virginia, to their academy there to train to be a special agent. The only thing standing in my way was Newt Gingrich was actually the Speaker of the House at the time, and there was a hiring freeze at the FBI due to various budget issues that most of your viewers and listeners know is common with the federal government fighting over the budget and closing down the government, etc. So at that time, I had literally gone through all of the requirements for the FBI, and then they had a hiring freeze, so I couldn't actually get that phone call, and the plane ticket to Quantico, Virginia. Mm-hmm. So while I was waiting, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, their San Francisco office, called me. This was about June of 1993. And asked if I'd be interested in a position as an IRS special agent. And, as I say, I had my heart set on the FBI, but the FBI wasn't able to hire me. And so I went ahead and went forward with the IRS qualification process. They had to do yet another background investigation on me. And lo and behold, in November of 1993, I accepted a position with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, or CID for short. And again, the IRS has special agents just like the FBI, the Secret Service, the Customs Service. All the different federal agencies have the term special agent because it refers to basically a gun-carrying criminal investigator. So the IRS is no exception, and as I said, they had anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 of these criminal investigators throughout the country, and I began work in the IRS CID in November of 1993, and I expected to spend a full 20-year law enforcement career. They do have a little plum, a career in federal law enforcement, in that you have a 20-year career span, not 25 or 30 years. So by this time, at 56 years old, I would have been long since retired, earning quite the sweet pension, but things took a turn in a different direction.
Yeah, so fascinating. So you wanted to go into the FBI, hiring freeze, you end up at the IRS. That's kind of where this whole journey starts, because I would imagine day one at the IRS, you're thinking, this is a reputable part of the government. This is an important position to keep the government functioning. Were those the type of things that were going through your mind at that time?
Absolutely. I mean, as much as the IRS, had its bad reputation, I still believe today. I haven't lost the belief or that governments need to raise revenue, and their laws are passed in order to extract, at least pursuant to law, a particular amount of money from the public in different ways by, taxing airline tickets, to taxing firearms, to taxing, income from certain people. So, I certainly felt it was a legitimate function, and I really took quite a lot of joy, not in throttling the public, but in realizing that the Treasury needed to be protected. They needed to have financial investigators who could comb through financial records and actually build a criminal case for those who had intentionally, willfully, violated the federal tax laws to, cheat on their income taxes.
And you would say that during your time there, you had instances where you had to arrest individuals for these instances, for different crimes that are supposed crimes that they were committing?
Yes, I made arrests. I did executed search warrants where I'd be the door kicker, as they say. You get the search warrant, and then with shotgun raised, kick down a door or with the battering ram and go in and secure the premises, have the hair standing up on the back of your neck because you don't know what you're going to encounter. You do as much intel gathering ahead of time, of course, so it's not completely unknown. I also worked with local agencies around the San Francisco Bay Area and went on search warrants with those agencies. So, I never shot at anyone, never killed anyone, but had to be prepared to use deadly force if necessary, according to the policies and of course use of deadly force, which is a last resort.
Okay, got it. So you start at the IRS. For years you're executing search warrants, investigating records, and criminally prosecuting individuals. And at some point it took a turn, because obviously if it didn't, you would be collecting that pension today and probably in semi-retirement. So talk to us about that journey. I think you mentioned in some previous videos I saw that just some different individuals started saying that, hey, there's no law requiring a personal income tax filing. And is that kind of where this journey started for you?
Yeah, pretty darn close, Robert. Basically, the first 3 years of the 5.5 years that I was there, I enjoyed the job immensely. And again, not because I was able to shake down people for their, meal receipts or entertainment receipts, but I was working on high-level money laundering and income tax cases jointly with the FBI, the DEA. Really doing some interesting investigations and investigating some very bad people. So that's why I say I enjoyed the job. It was very rewarding to know that I was a financial investigator. So certainly a lot of office work, but also getting out there and doing the necessary street work that would also bring the cases to fruition as well. So at about the 3-year mark, I was listening to a talk radio show in the San Francisco Bay Area. The call letters, the station is still there, KSFO in San Francisco. And I was assigned down at the San Jose office, about 50 miles to the south of San Francisco. Most of your listeners are probably well familiar. That's where the San Jose Sharks come from. Anyway, I was listening to this talk radio show, and this guest, D.V. Kidd, first name is spelled D-E-V-V-Y, it's kind of unusual. D.V. Kidd was talking about the federal income tax, the Federal Reserve, New World Order, these kinds of terms that back in 1996 were a lot different than people
almost
today.
No one was discussing it at that point. William Cooper, or maybe a handful of others, but
Right. So it's always important, I think, to look at the time frame of what was happening. And so I'm listening to this woman, and the show that she was on, I had always thought that the talk show host, he was a former military guy. He wasn't a partisan kind of guy. He was about what's right or wrong, not who is right or wrong. And I really liked that about him. He was also very pro-Constitution, or protection of the Constitution. And since I had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, that especially had a lot of meaning to me in the way that he broadcast his show. So
I think that's really important to kind of emphasize that point. The Constitution is really the foundation that brings anyone who's an American together. And I think you would hear from many bureaucrats and politicians that they take the oath, but they kind of interpret it their own way sometimes. And I feel like you were interpreting it from actually how it's written, not your own personal feelings on the document, at least from the actions that I've learned about you.
Very, very accurate and intuitive point. I was very mindful of it. I think unlike most people, and I don't say that to elevate myself above, it's just sadly deficient. You're correct. I don't know if your listeners and viewers are aware, but the U.S. Constitution actually requires that oath to be administered to people that work for the federal government. So it's a constitutional, it's an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And the Constitution actually requires that each and every rank and file employee, worker that carries out federal business, takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And I mean, it just makes common sense that if individually each person is supposed to take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, then you need to be mindful, at least if you're going to have integrity, to be mindful of what the Constitution says and be mindful of when it might be time to speak up when you're supporting and defending it.
Yeah, I really think it is. And what really gets me with the IRS and how your whole story really stuck out to me is I don't see in the Constitution where there was a personal income tax, right? So a lot of people claim that I believe the 16th Amendment gave them additional powers to tax. And that's what that movie Freedom to Fascism really kind of gets at. And that's what really opened my eyes, saying, well, are we supposed to really be taxing individuals? Because I think it's about a third of revenue right now for the government comes from personal income taxes, roundabout. I think that's correct. So that's a third of the revenue, where really I don't think the original founders had that idea in mind.
Again, very, very good points. From basically the founding of the country until 1913, the federal government was able to operate just fine without an income tax. There was an attempt to have an income tax back in the 1860s, like basically right after the Civil War, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. And that is what led to, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, this effort to amend the Constitution with an amendment that eventually became the 16th Amendment. And in fact, as you said, or partially said, there are entities, one of them being the IRS, that tells the public that the 16th Amendment basically gives them this carte blanche ability to assess and collect the income tax. But the Supreme Court decisions and the evidence actually show that to be a lie. So, of course, it's a very detailed subject, but in a nutshell, it's the IRS itself that will tell the public, well, there's no need to argue about these little niceties about the income tax. 16th Amendment came about in 1913, and so we have this carte blanche authority, and so you need to, sit down and shut up.
Yeah, and I want to dive into how you came to that conclusion, but let's spend a minute here on the year of 1913, because that really was a pivotal year for the country in my mind, and you just mentioned that. Not only did they create the income tax with the IRS creation, they also created the Federal Reserve at the same time, or actually I believe the Federal Reserve was passed December 23rd with only like 3 or 4 members of Congress present. Woodrow Wilson was the president at the time who signed these bills into law. I think there's a lot of facts showing that Woodrow Wilson was really a puppet to the large financiers at that time, mainly the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, J.P. Morgan. And from my research, it seems like the J.P. Morgans, what people are now calling cabal, were really the ones pushing for the IRS and for the Federal Reserve. Is that also what your research is showing as well?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't just a coincidence, as you're pointing out, that the Federal Reserve Act came in the same year as the alleged ratification of the 16th Amendment. And I say alleged because there's a whole separate story about the ratification process. And I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but we'll just kind of set that aside as far as whether or not it was actually ratified. But both the Federal Reserve Act and the 16th Amendment came into existence in 1913. And you're correct, it was December of 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress and signed by the President. And those two systems, the income tax system and the monetary system, the Federal Reserve, are joined at the hip. They really can't function without one another. And most people that begin to research the facts will see that is a fact, that they need both, they need each other to really function. because of the fiat money creation, which is what the Federal Reserve Act authorized. And of course, again, it would kind of get into the weeds to talk about the constitutionality of creating money out of thin air. But
well, no, I want to touch on that because the Constitution, and I don't have the section in front of me, but from me reading the Constitution, I think there's a specific clause that say only debts shall be paid in gold and silver. It's written in the Constitution. So the Federal Reserve now with a fiat currency is, to me, completely unconstitutional, yet no one seems to be batting an eye. And actually, when I argue it with friends and family members or people that I'm discussing on our interviews or social media, everyone thinks that the Federal Reserve is one, federal and not a private institution, which I believe the government only owns about 20% of the Federal Reserve, and it's kind of unclear on who owns the rest of it. They do have some power in terms of the Board of Governors and appointing a Fed chairman. But I think that's a really big point, because if the Constitution and the founders said, hey, we have to have sound money with gold and silver backing it, we basically threw that out the window, and no one seems to care at this point.
Well, yeah, I think no one, at least in people that could actually help the American people to make a change or make things right. There's tons of case law where judges, poo-poo any arguments that you were kind of mentioning in that theme. So it's a very deep subject, but sadly, what the people can easily recognize as a fiat money system that wasn't called for in the Constitution, judges can find a myriad of excuses as to why it shouldn't be touched. And as with the income tax, all we can do is try to spread the word to our fellow Americans, and maybe if we get enough people behind it, actually do something about it. And of course, Ron Paul, your listeners and viewers may be familiar with the former congressman. He, of course, was very vocal about the Federal Reserve and the income tax. And as you said, the movie America, Freedom to Fascism was also instrumental in waking up millions of Americans. So anyway, here I am, 20 years after leaving the IRS and still singing the same song. And I do think people are waking up a lot more. As I said, in 1996, when I first heard this information, I'm just like, wow, this sounds like conspiracy theories, kind of thing. And but and that's of course the stigma that was attached, so that people would avoid looking into it. And of course, I was a trained investigator, so I wasn't going to shy away from investigating whether or not these issues had some factual basis. And in fact, as you mentioned, the reason I no longer work for the IRS is because I found plenty of facts to back up what we've been talking about.
And I think this is really key, and I think this, to me, why you're one of the most pivotal figures in this entire awakening, this movement to really understand the truth of what's going on. Because you just said that you are in the belly of the beast. You are a professional investigator, right? You're not just a conspiracy theorist. You're not an Alex Jones who gets callers calling in and reads articles. You investigated this pretty deeply. Can you talk about that process, and how did you go from arresting someone one day to eventually leaving the IRS? How did that discovery process work for you?
Well, that radio show that I talked about started the journey, and it was about a 2-year journey, because I began gathering evidence and information in January of 1997. And as I might have mentioned, the actual month, February of 1999, is when I resigned. So there was about a 2-year period of evenings, weekends, driving my wife crazy and having to take away from time that I would have normally spent with my 2 sons to begin to, after my 50 hours of work were done each week, because criminal investigators for the IRS and really for all federal agencies work 50-hour work weeks. So after that, and after the commute, then I would get to hit the books to find out, why was none of this stuff ever on the CPA exam? Why was I never taught this at San Jose State University? Why did I not talk? Why was none of this talked about in my IRS training, that occurred after I was hired? And so I basically had to dig deeply into Supreme Court case law, the actual statutes and regulations, many things that are really basically glossed over when you're studying or training to become a certified public accountant or studying and training to be an IRS special agent. A lot of these foundational aspects are glossed over. What they have you concentrate on is, is home mortgage interest deductible? And if so, how high can the mortgage be until it's phased out? And, what are exemptions versus deductions? And what's a refundable credit versus this? So it was more all the surface stuff that surrounds the income tax and very little of the foundational stuff. So the radio show kind of caused me to look at the foundations. And I also found that it wasn't like I developed my own little opinion or viewpoint on this. I was looking at Supreme Court case law and statutes and regulations that were, it's black letter law. I don't need to opine on if the Supreme Court says something about the income tax. That's the law of the land. That's even what the IRS admits in its own procedure manual, that Supreme Court cases are the law of the land. Mm-hmm. So I delved into these foundational issues that no one ever taught me in training to become a CPA, getting an accounting degree, which of course included income tax education, or my training at the IRS. None of these foundational issues were explored, or very little. And so I just began that process over that 2-year period of starting, kind of with the basics, the 16th Amendment, the Supreme Court case law, what the statutes and regulations really said, not only as they were depicted in the 90s, but how they were depicted in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, all the way back to 1913 with the passage of the original First Income Tax Act.
So in your finding, you're saying that there's Supreme Court rulings that invalidate personal income tax. You're not talking about all taxes, correct? You're talking about specifically personal income tax?
Well, they don't invalidate it. What basically happened, and I'll try to make this in a nutshell as brief as I can. As we discussed earlier in the show, there were forces, there were people and groups who wanted an income tax, right? You mentioned some of the names. And so they passed the 16th Amendment. They at least told the public that it had been ratified. And immediately in October of 1913, the First Income Tax Act was passed by Congress and signed by the President. And that act did in fact tax the incomes of the average American. But what happened was, in 1916, there was a court case, a Supreme Court case called Brushaber, Brushaber, and I would encourage people to look up the case or go to my website, which you'll probably give out at some point, and they can read the case for themselves. But the Brushaber case in 1916 basically explained to everyone that the 16th Amendment did not expand federal taxing power, that it only clarified the power. And because the two ways that the federal government can tax is either with an excise or indirect tax, or a direct tax. And so the Brushaber Court and many other Supreme Court cases, again, I show on my website and many other websites, it's everywhere. You just have to look, and the IRS tries to hide these facts from the public. But if you look, you'll see that the Supreme Court said that the 16th Amendment did not expand federal taxing power beyond what was there prior to the 16th Amendment. And if you compare that to what the IRS tells the public, that, oh yeah, we have the 16th Amendment, that's our carte blanche, sit down and shut up, those are very disparate conclusions. So what happened was that once the Brushaber case was decided in 1916, the Congress had kind of a uh-oh moment, and they created a new Income Tax Act that repealed that 1913 Act that, as I say, had a blanket or broad application to the citizens of this country, and backtracked so that only non-resident aliens and foreign corporations were actually brought into the income tax web, shall we say. And so from 1916 forward, if you actually follow the income tax acts that came in 1918 and 1924 and 1934 and 1936 and on, there was the 1939 Internal Revenue Code, the 1954 Internal Revenue Code, the 1986 Internal Revenue Code. The nice thing about this this journey is there's a paper trail. And as probably, again, most of your viewers know, the IRS will certainly use a paper trail against you if they're going to, pursue you with an audit or a criminal investigation. But there's a nice paper trail showing exactly, proving out exactly what I'm saying. And of course, I'm not some guru who says, it's my opinion, you need to believe me. All I'm asking you to do is look at the facts and decide for yourself. But the bottom line is that there's nothing illegitimate about the income tax laws as they're written, as they're passed. They're absolutely constitutional. The point is that the laws actually don't embrace the average American. And that is a fact that's been there in existence since 1916. And
so you're saying that the findings, this is key. You're saying that your findings, that the court rulings have stated that an American citizen would not apply under these laws.
No, not that the court has ruled that the court, if you read the Bruchaber case in 1916, the Bruchaber court said that the 16th Amendment did not expand federal taxing power. So that point right there shows the IRS to be a liar, okay? Because they tell the public, 16th Amendment is our carte blanche, sit down and shut up. Well, that's not what the Supreme Court said in 1916 or dozens of other cases around that same time frame. And then the backtracking is clearly evident by a review of the 1916 Income Tax Acts, and then every act that was passed every 1 or 2 years from 1916 all the way to 1938. And then 1939 was the first Internal Revenue Code, where it was actually codified into a book of Internal Revenue Codes. And then the 39 Code morphed into the 1954 Code, and then the 1986 Code. But the point is that you can see the paper trail of this history that ever since 1916, the only people or entities that were actually, encompassed in it or grabbed by the income tax laws, the federal income tax laws, are non-resident aliens and foreign corporations, or Americans if they were to work abroad and have a domicile or live abroad for some period of time. There are provisions that could actually make them have to pay an income tax being outside the country, living and working for some period of time. But the average American living and working in the United States, the income tax laws as they're written do not apply to the average American. And
so right there is the big statement, right? Where you're saying that the income tax laws don't apply to the average American citizen W-2 employee based off what the laws have said, what the court has said. But why are we under this impression every April everyone starts freaking out? They run to their H&R Block or their accountant, they get their W-2 or their 1099, and they stress about filing their income tax. Now, what I always thought was very interesting is you never get a notice to file, right? So it's more of a social pressure that's been built up for people to file their income taxes. I never got a note in March saying, Robert, your income taxes are coming up. here's the form to file it. Like I would when I register my car, which is a whole other debate. But when I need to re-register my car, I get a notice that I have to re-register my car. So I always thought that was very interesting. So you're basically saying that everyone's kind of being duped at this point, where society is kind of ingrained the idea of the income tax, and that's really where a lot of this stems from?
Yes, duped, intimidated, kept in the dark. Not like there's all kinds of levels of the process to make people believe, and of course, as I don't know if I have time to get into it, but I mean the IRS can hammer people, and they hammered me with an indictment in 2004 and a criminal and prosecution in 2005, and I was acquitted of the charges because basically the charges were brought to try to discredit and silence me. But again, we could set that on the table to discuss if and when you're ready. But it's through this selective prosecution, going after people that are like myself, actually trying to engage the public and enlighten them, and just saying, hey, look at these facts. You don't have to believe me. Here's just some facts that the IRS won't tell you about. And you would think that in a country that's supposed to be of, by, and for the people, that if the people decided that they'd had enough of the income tax, then we wouldn't have one anymore, right? We'd move to some other system. Or if the American people are happy with the income tax, then fine. But what's really gone on is it's taxation without legislation. There's legislation there, but the group of people that's being taxed, it's almost like the legislation is here, and who the IRS is taxing is out here.
Right. So correct taxes that are within the law boundaries, as you stated before, would be foreign nationals, people with green cards, potentially citizens living outside of the country. I'd imagine corporations, LLCs, business entities. I would imagine those taxes are legal. So we're really focusing on the income tax of American citizens, where it seems like that does not fit within the boundaries.
Well, there's actually questions, in terms of jurisdiction and what the laws actually reach out and touch. Like as I mentioned before, foreign corporations. But again, there's not the law. If you actually look at the law and who becomes liable for the tax, foreign corporations are mentioned, but not domestic corporations. And I'd like to focus more on the individual situation, because it really is a deep talk about a swamp. It's pretty deep. So I think it'd be better to kind of concentrate on the individual faction. But the fact of the matter is, when I say non-resident aliens, of course that would be people, actual persons or human beings, and foreign corporations, would be foreign corporations that might do business in the United States. But anything domestic, a domicile of a corporation in the country, with customers in the country, if everything is domestic about it, then at least the rule, at least if you look at the way the statutes and regulations are written, they're written to embrace foreigners, foreign transactions, Americans who travel abroad and work abroad. There has to be some international connection to it.
Interesting. Wow, it's really a fascinating predicament we're in, and the bigger problem is that they're trying to squash people like you from getting the truth out. You had to go through, I would imagine it was months, if not years, of legal battles. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you were acquitted with your legal battles. You won, you said, a civil suit and a criminal indictment. And I think you've also done that with some clients as well. And to me, that's really the big piece here that really validates what you're saying. Because if you were just making this up, or these weren't actual facts, you would have been held liable for something. But you were acquitted, because the jury and the system couldn't find you guilty of what they were claiming you were.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would like to phrase it is that first explanation is that I've never in 20 years since leaving the IRS and trying to be a cheerleader for everybody, one-on-one, taking on the IRS and, unsheathing your sword and, beating them with the truth, because we don't have that kind of a landscape. So I don't push people. I push people to educate themselves. That's really all I can do and, maintain my integrity, because the IRS is still the 800-pound gorilla that will, sit on people until they can't breathe and force them to comply. So, I've never been that kind of a cheerleader that say, hey, go out to the front lines and, hey, so they cut your legs off or, hey, you can still. Well,
a lot of the people on the front lines do get their legs cut off. I mean, look what happened to you. I've heard stories of Irwin Schiff. Similar situation. He was writing literature. I'm not exactly sure on that case, but a lot of people say that Harry Reid appointed the judge and the Nevada judge in his case, and they ended up throwing him in jail, and he died in jail. And you can go. There's a laundry list of people that's happened to. So
that's right.
I think you're right. When you try to go against the beast, whether you're right or wrong, they can come at you and do some real damage.
Right. So what I do is I just encourage people to educate themselves, and that at least they can see in me that I've maintained hope after 20 years, and I just try to be honorable with people that I talk to, that, this is a very intimidating, powerful agency, but the power that they wield it's illegitimate. Not because the laws are illegitimate. It's that they're enforcing and administering these laws outside of what was actually passed by Congress. And again, this isn't some opinion that people have to rely on me for. Just look at the facts. And again, you could start with my website, which I have a section called "What's This All About?" And I really try there, completely free and referring as much as possible to actual documentation and, very little opinion, if any, just have people go, what's this all about? And then just read through it and evaluate the evidence for themselves. And then they're going to have to decide, or we decide together, what we're going to do about it. Because again, I think it's fairly academic that in a government system, country where it's of, by, and for the people, that we have a right to be taxed in the way that we give permission to be taxed, right? Through laws that we allow our representatives in Congress to pass as a bill and then send to the president for signature. And there's never been a bill, a law passed that makes the average American liable to pay the federal income tax. And the IRS still to this day points out that the only people that have to file a tax return with the IRS are those who are liable for a tax. And again, this is all gone through at the What's This All About menu tab at my website.
And I just pulled that up so people can see. It's agentfortruth.com. I definitely recommend you go there. You also just released a book too. Do you want to discuss that for a second?
Sure, thank you. So it's called Investigating the Federal Income Tax, a Report to the American People. And at agentfortruth.com, that page, you have to scroll down a little bit. You can see more about the book. Basically, after this 2-year period that I mentioned earlier of evenings and weekends and trying to get to the bottom of whether this information was true or not, sifting through it, using the investigative skills that the IRS trained me for, I came to the conclusion, or at least a preliminary conclusion, that a lot of these actual factual information, and it should be presented to my supervisors at the IRS, because, as I said, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and I felt that I had a duty, not only because of the oath, but my ethics as a CPA at the time, to And my morals as a Catholic, to not bear false witness. And so I went to my supervisors at the IRS and I said, look, I've tried to go to bat for the agency and the income tax and defended all that I could, because my entire professional life revolves around the income tax, but I'm really kind of faltering here. The evidence seemed to indicate that there's some real problems. There's deceit going on, there's intimidation going on, and very possibly the IRS is actually enforcing the laws beyond what the laws actually authorize them to enforce, kind of a color of law type of enforcement. And so I basically said, if you cannot answer my questions, I'll be forced to resign because I can't serve two masters. And so they basically took me up on that little proposal and said, well, we're not going to answer your questions, we're not going to address any of your concerns, and we'll give you the paperwork necessary to tender your resignation. So I resigned from the IRS on February 25th, 1999, and just began telling my story just as I'm doing now 20 years later. And a bunch of basically the IRS tried to get my CPA certificate stripped from me, and they were successful.
They were? Interesting.
Yeah. So I was a CPA for 15 years. I never had a single blemish against the license. No instances with clients, no complaints whatsoever. But then the IRS made a complaint against me, and eventually that led to my CPA license being stripped. So, I'm a defrocked CPA, but people would have to look into why that is and whether it was, I was defrocked because of some integrity issue or because I'm blowing the whistle on the situation.
Well, it's just another reason why I'm really against these occupational licenses. I'm a licensed real estate broker, and what prevents them from hearing this video right now and saying we want to shut this guy down and going after that license. So I think occupational licensing really gives them a lot of power over the individual.
It's unfortunate, yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I've come to that conclusion many years ago that it's really more of a way to keep you on a leash than it is to protect the public. And it may not go for every license. I'm not dismissing that there may be needs for some licensing, but it is absolutely a leash to keep people on a short leash so that the status quo is maintained.
So have there been any cases where someone has filed income tax or not filed and basically sued the IRS to get their income tax money back? Has that ever happened?
Well, actually, the reason that I was prosecuted was because my client wanted to do just that. And the reason that I was acquitted, the client was actually convicted, and it's kind of a long story, but he was tried separately. He had a separate trial from mine, and he made decisions that, in my opinion, were not the wisest decisions. He decided to represent himself without an attorney, and I decided that I wanted an attorney who was an expert, with court procedure. He wanted a speedy trial, meaning that he had less than 70 days to prepare to defend himself. I had about 7 months because I didn't want a speedy trial. I asked for extensions and postponements so that I could properly defend myself. He also, on the day that we were both arrested, he fled the arresting agents, whereas I gave up peacefully. I was out on bail within about 4 hours. He was put in jail upon his arrest, and he never got out before his trial or during his trial because he was a flight risk, because when they came to arrest him, he fled. He fled the arresting agents, and the California Highway Patrol had to throw out spike strips on Interstate 5 in order to apprehend him. So there's all kinds of reasons why he didn't do so well. I prepared, I had attorneys, and they were able to communicate my innocence, and I was acquitted of all those charges. And again, like you agreed, it's a story in and of itself, but it shows what the IRS is willing to do to keep the American people from hearing this information. And by all means, if somehow having a CPA stripped from me, makes me unbelievable, I don't think that really matters, because I just want people to look at the facts. And if the facts don't convince them, there's no way that I possibly could.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a big fracture in society right now, and anyone would say that, right? A lot of people say, oh, it's the left versus the right. But what I'm really seeing is more of the open-minded truth seekers in one half, or it's not even really half, it's probably a fairly small percentage of people that are really looking for the truth. They would hear your story and say, I don't care whether he's a CPA or not, I want to investigate this. And then there's the majority of people which believe official narratives. They still believe, oh, he got his CPA license taken away, I don't know if he's believable. So there's still a large portion of people that I think that would be an issue with, unfortunately. And those people that probably have never even looked into this, they're probably not even aware that the Federal Reserve is 80% private. They don't understand how the IRS tax and everything else came about. And I think if we could just educate people and open their eyes just to that fact, it would move things along. But so you've been doing this for 20 years now, and I'm kind of amazed. If I was in your shoes, I'd probably be extremely frustrated and saying, 20 years later, they're still pulling the same things. Do you think that in the future this could ever change, where maybe we actually get back to a legal IRS system?
Yeah, I have hope. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, because it's not up to me. I mean, it's up. I'm a believer in God, and God has His timetable, and it's not according to my lifespan. I'd like to think that my efforts are contributing in the right direction. I really believe that they are, but I think my job is to just maintain my patience and just do my best. And I'll ask my fellow Americans is to do their best. And if there aren't enough Americans that care about these issues, they'll never get changed. But the bottom line for me is this, that for 5.5 years, I had a job where I was investigating people and helping a prosecutor that if we could convict them to put them in prison. And I'll be darned if that's why I left, is I'm not going to increase the political prisoner population in the United States of America. We have political prisoners, and I don't think we should. And so I just wasn't going to be a part of that. And I think if people stack up the IRS's, or should I say compare the IRS's potential motivations to lie against mine, I think it's a slam dunk as to who's the one lying to the public. But all I can do is put up the reputation that I still maintain, minus some certifications and things. And people should realize that, for 15 years, I was a certified public accountant. I qualified to even become a CPA, and I was a CPA for 15 years. And then the reason that I'm no longer a CPA is because I spoke up, and then the IRS went after me. Mm-hmm. But I want people to make up their own mind about that. Again, it's not about me. It's about the information. And all I can do is keep talking about it. I don't do this for a living. Whenever I'm invited by great people such as yourself, I just tell my story. My regular work is just being a forensic accountant, which is basically a reconstructive accountant, working for law firms and sometimes directly with clients to reconstruct their financial records because of pending litigation, or they're just completely behind with keeping track of their stuff. So that's what I do, is forensic accounting. So I have the book, but it's not like I sell millions of copies. It's really just an effort to tell the truth, and certainly tell the truth when asked to do so.
No, I appreciate it, and I think there are several thousand other Americans that appreciate it. I think you made a really good point on why would you lie about this? Why would you lie to get indictments and to get, lose your CPA license? That doesn't make sense to me. And what you said just a second ago really tells me about your character, where you're out there putting people in prison. And I remember last year I was on the jury for a murder trial, and they're doing the jury selection. I wasn't selected because when they came to me, I said, I don't even know if I'd be able to rule in the state's favor because I believe in the non-aggression principle. And the fact to be able to really, in my point of view, kidnap and imprison someone. Most people would say arrest, convict, and imprison. But I think if we change the verbiage of it, kidnap and imprison someone, it should be used in very, very rare cases. Yet we have the highest prison population in the world. We're imprisoning people. I believe over 80% of prisoners right now are in prison for non-violent crimes. So basically, the legislatures can create a law, or, as you're saying, the IRS can enforce something that isn't even a law and put you in prison. And to me, that's very worrisome, and I'm more concerned by the general population's laissez-faire attitude to the whole situation. I guess if it doesn't happen to you or someone you know personally, it's just a number on a piece of paper, is kind of the opinion that I get from most people.
Yeah, and you bring up some excellent points, and I think it does. It really would be better off. We'd all be better off if we cared about our neighbor. Now, of course, there's a Christian principle, right, about love your neighbor as yourself. But it just seems like even atheists could understand that if your neighbors want your best interests as well as their own, we're going to have a lot more cohesive, pleasant society. So I don't see how anyone can lose by supporting, the concept that we actually care what's going on with our fellow Americans. And you're absolutely right. Many people don't get audited. Very few Americans get prosecuted, by the IRS, which of course is another myth. I don't encourage people to go out and mess with the IRS, but if they look at how many people are even prosecuted per year, people think that if they miss one receipt, they're going to go to prison. And if they actually saw how few prosecutions there are, when there's 350 million Americans, they would see how much the fear that's been built up in the public, how well that serves the whole tax enforcement apparatus.
Well, the IRS also has some specific powers that no one else has, such as if they do think that you owe them back taxes, they will go into your bank account directly and take money from your account without a judgment order to do so. Is that correct? I mean,
Another great point. Basically, as I've illustrated, but I'll point out explicitly, the only way that I could get a jury to evaluate my conduct as it pertained to the income tax was to get criminally prosecuted because the civil function of the IRS, their auditing, their collections, that's all civil. And the only way that you can get a jury to evaluate your conduct there is to pay the exorbitant assessment that the IRS comes up with, say in an audit. Let's say that you paid $5,000 in income tax for the year, or let's say $10,000. Then the IRS audits you and says, oh, you actually owed $40,000. And they create this $30,000 variance. Well, the only way that you can get a jury to evaluate whether or not you're correct is to pay the $30,000 that the IRS is claiming you owe before you even get your ticket into court. So it's totally lopsided. It's part of the reason why I'm not this Pied Piper leading people to, charge the IRS one by one. We need to stick together. We need to educate ourselves. But you've made nothing but fantastic points throughout the show, and that's another great one, that you have to be criminally prosecuted to get a jury. And I mean, who wants to get criminally prosecuted just to have a jury evaluate your conduct? Because even then, the jury pool is made up of Americans who may not be aware of these issues. And the prosecutors are trying to paint you as a, miscreant. You don't want to pay your fair share. You're really a jerk trying to get something over on your fellow Americans. And how many people can have the right defense team that doesn't just get them off on some technicality, but can actually, prove your innocence?
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, by the grace of God, I had hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the country who were contributing to my legal defense, which, by the way, it cost about $250,000 to defend myself. And what came out of my pocket was about 7 months of my life preparing for trial, preparing for like the final exam of my life. But that's how much contributions I got to, basically vanquish the beast. But as I said, in the jury trial, the jurors could see that this was a complete railroad, and they acquitted me because they saw no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. But on the civil side, getting defrocked of my CPA and all these things, well, those were administrative law judges and judges who decided that I was, a bad news, and I should, face all these civil consequences. So I don't at all mean to let people think that I just, I'm this Don Quixote that's won every battle against the IRS. But I think they'll see that the way I've been attacked, it's like, was Banister really that bad of a guy to face all this? Or is this the IRS trying to do whatever they can to silence me, to discredit the message, and hide all this evidence?
Yeah, I mean, so many good points. The power of judges is just insane, and for them to make rulings on your life, whether it's the CPA or, they can rule whether something could be unconstitutional obviously to everyone else, but this one person says it's not, and they have the power to do so. To me, is just another insane aspect of our overall system. So I want to wrap this up, but before we end it, I want to say, how could we change this? If Donald Trump, who's now the president, woke up today and said, I didn't realize, I just heard this interview with Joe Banister, I didn't realize this was going on, could he have the power to change this overnight? Well,
he could. I mean, he's obviously the chief executive of the executive branch, and he could rein in the IRS and make them obey the law. And like I say, I don't have any problem with the law. It wouldn't matter if I did or didn't. The law is plain, but it's, again, at the What's This All About section, people can read how the IRS has deceived the public all these years. But one thing Donald Trump could do is he could get into the inner sanctum of the IRS and actually get together the documents that would prove that the IRS is lying. I say the different researchers in the tax movement and myself, we've gathered together quite a treasure trove of documents showing how much they lie. But there's still even more that the IRS and the Department of Treasury will not let the public see. So somebody like Trump could actually get that information, that evidence disclosed, and let the people make up their mind one way or the other.
To me, that's really the only person in a position that is electable that we could actually have affect this, because all the people at the IRS are unelected. I don't believe there's an elected official in that branch of government. No. Congress has very limited oversight powers. Even if they were to pass a new law, obviously they're not even enforcing correctly the laws that have been passed by Congress. So to me, the only way to change this is either have a extreme mass awakening where the public just gets so furious with them that they're forced to change, or have the chief executive, the president of the United States, actually make the change. To me, those are the only options I see.
Yeah, I agree. And as I've said, I'm just one guy. So one guy with a computer cam and a microphone, and accepting a very gracious invitation from you. But ultimately, the people watching and listening have to decide if they care because you can care about it and you can educate yourself. And in my opinion, it's still it's not dangerous to educate yourself, shall we say. There'll come a point, perhaps in the future, where Big Brother will know what you're thinking.
Well, they already know when you're searching, right?
Right. I mean, it's in
Yeah.
some sense maybe they already know that, but in terms of ramifications for simply educating yourself, that's still a fairly danger-free pursuit. So for those who don't want any danger,
China, it's not. China.
right?
We're seeing how that could enact, and I see that Chinese system being implemented here. And you're right. We have a short window of time, I think, to really educate and try to change the system, or else it's going to be too late. That's
Right.
a really good point. Great. So, Joe, thanks for coming on. Were there any other points that you wanted to mention before we ended this interview?
I just can't remember if we talked about the film, because as you said, America Freedom to Fascism was instrumental in opening your eyes. And so, I imagine you've already done it, but encourage your listeners and viewers to watch the film. They can go to YouTube or, on the internet and watch it for free and watch the movie and see what they think.
Yeah, I highly recommend that. I recommend going to your website, agentfortruth.com. You have a lot of documentation on there. That's a great place to start this journey. I also recommend people to actually look at the laws he's referring to. How many people have actually read the 1913 Income Tax Act or the Federal Reserve Act? I've actually read those documents. They're available on the congressional website. And when you read those documents, it really opens your mind, because when someone says to you, oh, the Federal Reserve is not a private institution, they obviously have not actually read the law, because if you read the law, it's very black and white. And I think everything that you've mentioned today is really about looking at the documentation. As you said, it's black and white when you actually read the facts. When you don't read the facts and you're just going off of what society and the mainstream media has been telling you, is where you kind of get confused and you don't know which side to believe. So, Joe, thanks for coming on. This has been NowDaily.com. You can go to Now Daily on our YouTube channel to watch this video, and we hope to have you back in the near future, and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Robert. Take care.
You got it. Thanks. Okay, great. Ending the stream. I thought that was a really good interview. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Well, no, you're a great interviewer. You have excellent points, and what's kind of funny is that we're off air now.
Yeah.
Definitely. My son, I've got